The morning sun was bright over Seattle as Margaret Williams walked into Henderson's grocery store. She was 73 years old with silver hair and warm brown eyes that had seen many things in life. Her hands shook a little from arthritis, but she managed well enough. She had come to buy groceries for dinner because her grandchildren were coming to visit that evening. Margaret loved cooking for them and wanted everything to be perfect. She walked slowly through the automatic doors and grabbed a shopping cart. The store was busy as usual with people rushing around doing their weekend shopping. Margaret didn't mind the crowd. She liked seeing families together and hearing children laugh as they passed by. She made her way to the produce section where fresh vegetables and fruits were displayed in neat rows. She needed tomatoes and onions for the spaghetti sauce she planned to make. Her grandson Danny loved her homemade sauce more than anything else. As she reached for a bag to put tomatoes in, her elbow accidentally knocked against a display of apples. 3 apples rolled off the stand and fell to the floor. Margaret gasped and immediately bent down to pick them up, though her knees protested with sharp pain. A young employee nearby saw what happened and started to walk over to help her. Before he could reach her, someone else arrived first. Kevin Price was the store manager, and he had been watching from near the cash registers. He was 35 years old, tall, and always wore a frown on his face. He had been having a terrible week. His boss had yelled at him about sales numbers, his car had broken down, and his girlfriend had left him. None of that was Margaret's fault, but Kevin was looking for someone to take out his anger on. He marched toward Margaret with heavy steps that made other shoppers move out of his way. His face was red and his jaw was tight. When he reached the produce section, he stopped right in front of Margaret, who was still trying to pick up the apples. She looked up at him with apologetic eyes. Kevin didn't care about the apology he saw in her face. All he saw was another problem to deal with in his already bad day. He pointed at the apples on the floor and spoke in a loud voice that made people turn their heads. His words were harsh and filled with anger. He told Margaret that she needed to pay for the apples she had knocked down. Margaret tried to explain that it was an accident and that she would be happy to pay for them anyway. She spoke softly and respectfully because that was how she had been raised. Her mother had taught her to always be kind even when others were not kind to her. But Kevin wasn't interested in her explanation. He kept talking louder and louder. Then he said something that made the blood drain from Margaret's face. He made a comment about her race using words that hurt worse than any physical pain. Several shoppers gasped when they heard what he said. A young mother standing nearby pulled out her phone and started recording. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. She had experienced racism before in her long life, but it never stopped hurting. She had lived through times when things were much worse than they were now. She had marched for civil rights when she was young. She had raised her children to be strong and proud. And now here she was, being humiliated in a grocery store by someone young enough to be her grandson. Before Margaret could say anything else, Kevin reached out and grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into her thin skin with force that was completely unnecessary. He told her that she was coming with him to the manager's office right now. Margaret winced in pain and tried to pull her arm away, but Kevin's grip was too strong. She asked him to please let go because he was hurting her. Her voice shook as she spoke. Kevin ignored her completely. He started pulling her toward the back of the store, practically dragging her along. Margaret stumbled and nearly fell. Her shopping cart was left behind in the produce section. Other customers watched in shock as this elderly woman was being manhandled by the store manager. Some people looked away because they didn't want to get involved. Others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. One man started to step forward to intervene, but his wife held him back, worried about what might happen if they got involved. The young employee who had first seen the apples fall was frozen in place, not knowing what to do. He was only 17, and this was his first job. He had never seen his manager act this way before. Helen Carter, the assistant manager, heard the commotion from the next aisle over. She came around the corner just in time to see Kevin dragging Margaret toward the back offices. Helen had worked at Henderson's grocery store for 15 years, and she had never liked Kevin. He had only been manager for 6 months, but in that time he had made everyone's life miserable. He was rude to employees and dismissive of customer complaints. Helen had reported his behavior to corporate twice, but nothing had been done about it. Now she was watching him assault an elderly customer right in front of everyone. She knew she had to do something. Margaret's arm throbbed with pain as Kevin pulled her through the store. She felt humiliated and scared. What she didn't know was that the watch on her other wrist was doing something important. It wasn't an ordinary watch. It was a military-grade device that her daughter had given her last Christmas. Patricia had insisted that Margaret wear it all the time for safety. The watch monitored Margaret's vital signs constantly. It tracked her heart rate, blood pressure, and stress levels. It also had GPS tracking and a small camera. When the watch detected that Margaret's heart rate had spiked to a dangerous level and her stress hormones were flooding her system, it automatically sent an alert. The signal traveled up through the atmosphere, past the clouds beyond the sky, and into space. It reached an orbital defense station called Unity that circled the Earth. On that station, in a meeting room filled with important people from different planets, Admiral Patricia Williams was discussing trade agreements with alien ambassadors. She was focused on the negotiation when her personal emergency channel beeped. Only one thing could trigger that channel, and that was her mother's safety watch. Patricia looked down at her communication device, and her blood turned cold. Patricia Williams sat at the head of the conference table on the orbital station Unity. She was 48 years old and had been in the military for 26 years. She wore her admiral uniform with pride, and her chest displayed medals from battles that had saved humanity. Around the table sat ambassadors from 5 different alien species. They were discussing important trade routes that would benefit Earth and its colonies. Patricia was good at these meetings. She knew how to negotiate and how to make deals that helped everyone. But right now she wasn't thinking about trade routes. She was staring at the alert on her communication device with growing horror. The screen showed her mother's vital signs, and they were all wrong. Margaret's heart was racing at a dangerous speed. Her blood pressure was elevated. The stress markers were off the charts. Patricia tapped the screen to pull up the GPS location and saw that her mother was at a grocery store in downtown Seattle. Then she accessed the video feed from the watch camera. What she saw made her hands shake with rage. The small camera had captured everything. She watched as a man in a manager's uniform grabbed her mother's arm roughly. She heard the cruel words he said and saw her mother's face crumple in pain and humiliation. Patricia had fought against alien invaders who wanted to destroy Earth. She had commanded starships in battles that decided the fate of billions of people. She had faced down warlords and negotiators and criminals, but nothing had ever made her this angry. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. All conversation in the room stopped. The ambassadors looked at her with concern. Patricia's second-in-command, Lieutenant Carlos Murphy, immediately stood as well. He had served with Patricia for 8 years, and he knew that look on her face. Something was very wrong. Patricia spoke in a voice that was tight and controlled. She told the ambassadors that she had a family emergency and needed to leave immediately. The chief ambassador from the Zentari species started to protest. They were in the middle of delicate negotiations that had taken months to arrange. Patricia cut him off with a single look. Her eyes were hard as steel. She told them that the meeting would have to wait. Family came first always. She turned and walked out of the conference room with Murphy right behind her. As soon as they were in the hallway, Patricia broke into a run. Murphy had to sprint to keep up with her. He asked what was happening, but Patricia was already pulling up screens on her wrist device, sending orders to different departments. She told Murphy to assemble her personal security team in full tactical gear. She wanted 6 of her best soldiers ready to deploy in 2 minutes. Murphy's eyes widened, but he didn't question the order. He knew Patricia well enough to understand that she wouldn't call for tactical deployment unless it was absolutely necessary. He spoke into his comm device, sending the alert to the security division. Patricia was already heading toward the hangar bay. She called the Seattle Police Department directly, using her military override codes to get through to the chief. She told him to send officers to Henderson's grocery store immediately. There was an assault in progress. The police chief recognized her voice and asked if this was a terrorist situation. Patricia said no, but it was personal, and she needed officers there now. The chief promised to dispatch units right away. Next, Patricia contacted the hangar bay and ordered them to prep a dropship for immediate planetary descent. The officer on duty stammered that dropships required flight clearance and mission authorization. Patricia's voice went cold. She reminded him of her rank and told him that this was a direct order from a flag officer. The dropship would be ready in 90 seconds or she would have him court-martialed. The officer snapped to attention even though she couldn't see him and said, "Yes, Admiral." Patricia reached the hangar bay just as her security team arrived. They were 6 soldiers who had served with her in combat. They wore black tactical armor and carried weapons that could stop anything from a charging bull to an armored vehicle. Their leader was Sergeant Ben Hayes, a man who had saved Patricia's life twice in battle. He looked at his admiral and saw the fury in her eyes. He asked where they were going and what the threat was. Patricia showed him the video from her mother's watch. All 6 soldiers watched in silence. When it finished, Hayes's jaw was tight. He asked Patricia what she wanted them to do. She told them they were going to make sure her mother was safe, and that the man who hurt her faced justice. The dropship was waiting with engines already warming up. It was a sleek black aircraft designed for rapid deployment from orbit to planet surface. It could carry 20 soldiers and their equipment at speeds that would make civilian pilots faint. Patricia climbed aboard with her team right behind her. The pilot, a young woman named Kate Lewis, had already plotted the fastest course to Seattle. She told Patricia they would be on the ground in 8 minutes. Patricia strapped into her seat and pulled up the live feed from her mother's watch again. She watched as Kevin Price dragged Margaret through the store and into a back office. She saw him push her mother into a chair. Her hands clenched into fists so tight that her knuckles turned white. Sergeant Hayes sat down next to Patricia and spoke quietly. He reminded her that they needed to let the police handle this according to law. Patricia knew he was right. She was a military officer and she couldn't just storm in and attack a civilian, no matter how much she wanted to. But she could make sure that civilian knew exactly who he had messed with. She could make sure her mother was safe and that justice was served properly. The dropship's engines roared to full power and it launched from the hangar bay. Within seconds, they had left the orbital station behind and were screaming through space toward Earth's atmosphere. Kate Lewis was one of the best pilots in the fleet and she pushed the dropship to its limits. The craft shook as it hit the upper atmosphere, but she kept it steady. They descended through clouds at a speed that would have torn apart a civilian aircraft. Murphy had stayed behind on the station to handle the angry ambassadors, but he was monitoring everything through his comlink. He sent Patricia a message saying that the Seattle police had arrived at the grocery store. Patricia acknowledged the message but didn't slow down. She needed to be there herself. She needed to see her mother and make sure she was okay. The dropship broke through the cloud cover and Seattle appeared below them. Kate adjusted their trajectory, heading straight for the shopping district where Henderson's grocery store was located. People on the ground started to notice the military craft descending toward them. Cars pulled over and pedestrians stopped to stare up at the sky. A military dropship landing in a civilian area was not something that happened every day. In fact, it almost never happened unless there was a major emergency. Patricia didn't care about protocol or proper procedures right now. All she cared about was her mother. Inside Henderson's grocery store, Kevin Price had dragged Margaret into his small office at the back of the building. The office was cramped and messy with papers stacked on every surface. There was a desk with a computer, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been organized in years. Kevin shoved Margaret roughly into one of the chairs. She gripped the armrest to steady herself, her whole body shaking from the encounter. Her arm throbbed where his fingers had dug into her skin, and she knew there would be bruises tomorrow. Kevin stood over her with his arms crossed, still angry and not caring at all about how he had treated her. He told her that she was going to pay for those apples and for wasting his time. His voice was loud and mean. Margaret looked up at him with dignity despite her fear. She had faced worse things in her life than an angry store manager. She had lived through the civil rights movement. She had buried her husband after he died serving their country. She had raised 3 children mostly on her own while working 2 jobs. This man didn't scare her even though he had hurt her. She told Kevin in a calm voice that she would pay for the apples but that he had no right to handle her the way he did. She explained that what he did was assault and that she could press charges. Kevin laughed at her. He said she was just an old woman and nobody would believe her word over his. He was the manager and this was his store. He could do whatever he wanted. Margaret shook her head sadly. She felt sorry for this angry young man who thought power came from a title and a name tag. Real power came from character and integrity, things Kevin clearly didn't understand. Before Margaret could respond, the office door opened. Helen Carter stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face set in determination. Helen was 52 years old and had worked at this store longer than anyone else. She had short brown hair and kind eyes that right now looked very angry. She had seen what Kevin did to Margaret, and she had immediately called the police. Helen told Kevin that what he did was wrong and that the police were on their way. Kevin's face went from red to purple with rage. He shouted at Helen, telling her she had no right to call the police. Then he told her she was fired. Helen didn't even blink. She told Kevin that he couldn't fire her because only corporate headquarters could do that. She had been with the company for 15 years and she knew the rules better than he did. She turned to Margaret and asked if she needed medical attention. Margaret thanked her for her kindness but said she would be okay. Helen noticed the red marks on Margaret's arm and her face hardened. She took out her phone and took pictures of the marks. She told Margaret that this was evidence and it would help when the police arrived. Kevin tried to grab Helen's phone, but she stepped back quickly. She warned him not to touch her or she would add that to the charges. Kevin seemed to realize for the first time that he might actually be in trouble. Outside the office, in the main part of the store, customers were gathering in groups and talking in worried voices. Many of them had recorded the incident on their phones. Some had already posted the videos to social media. The videos showed clearly what Kevin had done. They showed him grabbing Margaret, making racist comments, and dragging her through the store. Within minutes, the videos started to spread. People shared them with friends who shared them with more friends. Local news reporters who monitored social media for stories saw the videos and immediately sent camera crews to the store. A hashtag started trending in Seattle and then spread to other cities. People were outraged that an elderly woman had been treated this way. Comments flooded in from all over the country and even from other parts of the world. Some people recognized Margaret from the small military medal she wore on her jacket. It was a medal given to families of fallen soldiers. Her husband Joseph had been a commander in the Earth Defense Fleet before he died in combat. But most people didn't know who Margaret was. They just saw an elderly black woman being abused by someone in authority, and they were angry about it. 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot with their lights flashing. Officers got out and headed into the store. Helen heard them arrive and went to meet them at the front. She quickly explained what had happened and led them to the back office. The officers took one look at Margaret's frightened face and Kevin's guilty expression and immediately understood the situation. One officer, a woman named Linda Brooks, knelt down beside Margaret's chair. She asked gently if Margaret was hurt and if she needed a doctor. Margaret showed her the marks on her arm. Officer Brooks took photos with her department-issued camera. The other officer, a man named Paul Grant, asked Kevin to step outside the office. Kevin tried to argue, but Officer Grant's expression made it clear this wasn't a request. In the parking lot outside, something strange was happening. People heard a sound unlike anything they had experienced before. It was a deep thrumming noise that seemed to vibrate in their chests. Everyone looked up at the sky. Through the clouds, a massive black shape was descending. It was a military dropship, the kind used for deploying troops in combat zones. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was a grocery store parking lot in a peaceful city on a peaceful day. The dropship came down slowly but with absolute precision. Its engines were incredibly powerful, and the blast of air they created sent shopping carts rolling across the parking lot. Several car alarms went off from the vibration. People backed away, not sure if they should be scared or amazed. The craft settled onto the pavement with landing gear that looked like it could support something 10 times its size. The engines began to wind down, but their humming could still be felt in everyone's bones. Camera crews that had arrived to cover the assault story now turned their cameras toward the dropship. This was something much bigger than a simple assault case. This was unprecedented. Military craft didn't land in civilian areas without major emergencies. Reporters spoke rapidly into their microphones, trying to describe what they were seeing to their viewers. The rear ramp of the dropship began to lower with a hydraulic hiss. Smoke or steam rolled out from inside, creating a dramatic effect. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see who or what would emerge. Then they saw her. Admiral Patricia Williams walked down the ramp in her full dress uniform. The uniform was dark blue with gold trim and her chest was covered in medals. Each medal told a story of bravery and sacrifice. She had the Star of Valor, the highest military honor. She had the Galactic Peace Cross for her work in preventing a war between species. She had campaign ribbons from battles that most civilians only read about in history books. Behind her came 6 soldiers in full tactical gear. They moved with the precision of elite troops fanning out to secure the area. Their weapons were holstered but visible, a clear reminder that these were not people to be trifled with. Patricia Williams stood at the bottom of the dropship ramp and surveyed the scene before her. The parking lot was filled with people, all of them staring at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. News cameras were pointed in her direction. Police officers stood near their cars, uncertain about what was happening. Patricia's gaze swept across the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers in battle. She was looking for threats, but also for information. She needed to know where her mother was, and she needed to know it now. Her voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. She asked in a tone that expected immediate answers where Margaret Williams was. The crowd parted slightly, and Helen Carter stepped forward. Helen was nervous, her hands shaking a little, but she stood straight and met the Admiral's eyes. She introduced herself as the assistant manager and explained that Margaret was inside in the office. She added that she had tried to help and had called the police. Patricia's expression softened just a fraction when she looked at Helen. She could see that this woman had done the right thing when others had stood by. Patricia thanked Helen for protecting her mother and asked for her full name. When Helen gave it, Patricia told her that she would be commended for her actions today. Those words made Helen stand a little taller despite her nervousness. Patricia then turned to Sergeant Hayes and gave quick orders. She told him to secure the building and make sure nobody left until the police had taken all necessary statements. She wanted a complete record of everyone who had witnessed what happened. Hayes nodded and gestured to his team. 2 soldiers moved to block the store exits while maintaining a professional demeanor. They weren't there to threaten anyone, but their presence alone was enough to make it clear that this situation was being taken very seriously. Patricia strode toward the store entrance with purpose. Her boots clicked on the pavement with a steady rhythm that somehow seemed louder than all the other noise around her. Customers who had gathered outside quickly moved out of her way. Some of them whispered to each other, recognizing her rank and wondering what an admiral was doing at a grocery store. Inside the store, employees and remaining customers pressed themselves against shelves and displays as Patricia walked past. Her face was set in an expression that revealed nothing, but her eyes burned with controlled fury. She had learned long ago how to channel her emotions into focused action. Losing control helped no one. She needed to be smart and deliberate about what happened next. Several store employees pointed toward the back where the offices were located. Patricia didn't need their directions because she had already pulled up the building layout on her wrist device, but she nodded her thanks anyway. These were civilians doing their jobs, and they didn't deserve to be caught up in this situation. Officer Brooks stepped out of the office when she heard the commotion of Patricia's arrival. She recognized the Admiral's uniform immediately and came to attention out of instinct. Patricia asked about her mother's condition, and Officer Brooks reported that Margaret had visible bruising on her arm, but otherwise seemed okay. She added that she had documented everything, and that the store manager was currently being questioned by her partner. Patricia thanked the officer for her professionalism, and then moved past her into the small office. The room seemed even more cramped with several people now inside. Margaret sat in the chair where Kevin had pushed her. When she saw her daughter, her eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from relief and love. Patricia crossed the room in 3 quick steps and knelt beside her mother's chair. Her stern expression melted away as she carefully examined the bruises forming on Margaret's thin arm. She touched them gently, her jaw tightening when she saw how bad they were. Patricia asked her mother if she was hurt anywhere else. Margaret shook her head and placed her hand on Patricia's cheek. She told her daughter that she was fine now that she was here. Patricia helped Margaret stand and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. For a moment, the powerful Admiral disappeared and there was just a daughter comforting her mother. Then Patricia looked up and saw Kevin Price standing against the far wall with Officer Grant nearby. Kevin's face had gone completely white. He finally understood who Margaret was and what he had done. He started to speak, stammering out an apology, but Patricia held up her hand to silence him. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, but it carried more weight than if she had shouted. She asked Kevin if he knew who Margaret Williams was. Kevin shook his head, unable to speak. Patricia told him that Margaret was her mother, which he had obviously figured out by now. But she also told him who Margaret had been before today. She explained that during the First Contact War, when humanity first encountered hostile alien species and thought it might be the end of civilization, Margaret had run emergency shelters in Seattle. She had coordinated evacuation efforts for thousands of families. She had kept people fed and safe and hopeful when everything seemed hopeless. She had worked 20-hour days for months, never complaining, always putting others first. Margaret had personally saved hundreds of lives through her organization and courage. Patricia's voice grew harder as she continued. She told Kevin that after the war, Margaret had continued to serve her community. She had volunteered at schools, worked with homeless shelters, and raised 3 children to be good people who contributed to society. One of those children had become an admiral. Another was a doctor who ran a free clinic. The third was a teacher who had won awards for his work with disadvantaged students. All of this, Patricia said, because Margaret Williams believed in treating people with dignity and respect, values that Kevin clearly knew nothing about. Kevin tried again to apologize, saying he didn't know. He was having a bad day, he made a mistake. Patricia's eyes turned cold. She told him that his ignorance was not an excuse. The issue wasn't that he had assaulted someone important. The issue was that he had assaulted anyone at all. If Margaret had been a stranger with no family and no connections, what Kevin did would still be completely wrong. The law applied equally to everyone, regardless of who they knew or what their status was. Patricia stepped closer to Kevin, her military bearing making her seem much taller than she actually was. She told him that he was going to answer for his actions today. Not because he had hurt an admiral's mother, but because what he did violated the basic principles of human decency. She said that his behavior was exactly the kind of thing that humanity had been trying to move beyond. They had joined a galactic community of different species and cultures. They represented Earth to the universe, and here he was acting like a petty tyrant in a grocery store, proving that some humans still had a long way to go. Officer Grant cleared his throat and stepped forward. He told Patricia that he appreciated her concern, but that the police would handle this from here. He reminded her gently that while her rank was impressive, this was a civilian matter and civilian law applied. Patricia nodded and stepped back. She knew he was right. She had made her point. Now the justice system needed to do its job. She helped her mother out of the office and into the main store area. Word had spread through the building about who Patricia was and why she was there. Customers and employees alike watched in silence as the Admiral walked her mother slowly toward the exit. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. News helicopters circled overhead. More police cars had arrived to help manage the situation. The scene outside Henderson's grocery store had transformed into something resembling a major news event. Television crews from every local station had arrived, along with several national networks. Reporters stood in front of their cameras describing what they knew so far, which wasn't much. But the presence of a military dropship in a civilian parking lot was enough to make this a major story. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing aerial footage of the dropship, the police cars, and the growing crowd of onlookers. Patricia helped her mother down the store's front steps slowly and carefully. Margaret was still shaky from the ordeal, but she held her head high. She had never been one to show weakness even when she felt it. Patricia kept a protective arm around her mother's shoulders as they walked. Sergeant Hayes and his team had formed a loose perimeter around them, not threatening anyone but making it clear that they wouldn't allow anyone to get too close. Reporters shouted questions from behind the police barriers that had been set up. They wanted to know why an admiral had deployed to a grocery store. They asked if this was a military emergency. They questioned whether there was a security threat. Patricia ignored all of them. Her focus was entirely on her mother. She guided Margaret to a clear area away from the chaos and helped her sit on a bench near the store entrance. A military medic from Patricia's team, a young man named Chris Palmer, approached with a medical kit. He had been a combat medic before joining the Admiral's security detail, and he knew his job well. He asked Margaret's permission before examining her arm. She gave it with a tired smile. Chris carefully documented the bruises, took her vital signs, and checked her over for any other injuries. He worked with gentle efficiency, explaining everything he was doing. When he finished, he reported to Patricia that Margaret had significant bruising and elevated blood pressure, but no serious injuries. He recommended that she see her regular doctor within 24 hours for a follow-up examination. Patricia thanked him and then turned her attention back to the situation at hand. Officer Brooks approached and asked if Patricia and Margaret would be willing to give official statements. Patricia said yes, absolutely, but she wanted to make sure her mother was comfortable first. She asked one of her soldiers to bring water and a blanket from the dropship's emergency supplies. Within minutes, Margaret was wrapped in a warm blanket and sipping water from a bottle. Inside the store, Officer Grant was placing handcuffs on Kevin Price. Kevin's face had gone from white to gray. He looked like he might be sick. The reality of what he had done and who he had done it to was finally sinking in. Officer Grant read Kevin his rights in a clear voice that carried through the store. Employees and customers watched in silence as their manager was arrested. Some of them pulled out phones to record this moment too. Officer Grant led Kevin out through the front doors and the waiting cameras immediately focused on him. Reporters shouted questions about why he had assaulted an elderly woman. They asked if he had anything to say to Margaret Williams. Kevin kept his head down and said nothing. His hands were cuffed behind his back and he shuffled toward the police car like a man walking to his own execution. The images of Kevin being arrested went viral immediately. People watching from home saw the contrast between him being led away in handcuffs and Admiral Williams standing protectively over her mother. The symbolism was powerful. Here was justice being served. Here was a daughter protecting her mother. Here was accountability for someone who had abused their small amount of power. But something else was happening too. Something that Patricia didn't expect. The story was spreading beyond just the immediate incident. People were talking about how many elderly people faced similar treatment every day. They discussed how retail workers sometimes abused customers, especially older customers who seemed vulnerable. They shared their own stories of witnessing or experiencing disrespect in stores. The conversation grew larger than just one assault in one grocery store. It became a discussion about dignity and respect and how society treated its elderly citizens. Margaret watched all of this unfold with thoughtful eyes. She saw the cameras and the crowds and the attention. Part of her wanted to just go home and forget this day had ever happened. But another part of her, the part that had marched for civil rights and organized communities and fought for justice her whole life, saw an opportunity. She turned to Patricia and said she wanted to make a statement. Patricia started to protest, saying her mother had been through enough and didn't need to face the cameras. But Margaret was firm. She said that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all the grandmothers and grandfathers who didn't have admirals for daughters. This was about using her platform to speak for people who had no voice. Patricia looked at her mother with a mixture of concern and admiration. She knew that tone in Margaret's voice. It was the same tone she used when she had made up her mind about something and nothing would change it. Patricia sighed and nodded. She told Sergeant Hayes to inform the press that Admiral Williams and her mother would make a brief statement in 10 minutes. Hayes raised his eyebrows but followed orders. The news spread through the crowd quickly, and reporters scrambled to get into position. Camera crews checked their equipment. Producers called their stations to make sure this would be broadcast live. In those 10 minutes before the statement, Patricia and Margaret sat together on the bench and talked quietly. Patricia wanted to make sure her mother was really up for this. Margaret assured her that she was. She had faced much harder things than a group of reporters. Patricia then asked what her mother planned to say. Margaret smiled and said she would speak from the heart like she always did. The 10 minutes passed quickly. Patricia helped her mother stand and they walked to an area that had been cleared by the police. Microphones were set up on a small stand. Patricia stood slightly behind and to the side of her mother, a silent show of support. Margaret looked out at the sea of cameras and reporters and curious onlookers. For a moment she felt overwhelmed by all the attention. Then she thought about all the people watching from home who had experienced similar treatment. She thought about elderly people who were dismissed and disrespected and sometimes abused by those who should be serving them. She thought about how she could use this moment to make a difference. Margaret stepped up to the microphones and the crowd fell silent. Her voice when she spoke was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as she continued. She thanked everyone for their concern and told them she was okay. She said that what happened to her today was wrong, but that she was one of the lucky ones. She had a daughter with resources and authority who could respond immediately. But what about all the other grandmothers and grandfathers who faced disrespect or rough treatment or discrimination in stores and hospitals and anywhere else? They deserved the same protection and the same justice even if they didn't have an admiral in the family. Margaret went on to say that she didn't want Kevin Price's life destroyed. She wanted him to understand why what he did was wrong. She wanted training for all retail workers on treating people with dignity. Margaret continued speaking to the cameras with a strength that surprised even her daughter. She talked about how corporations needed to be held accountable when their employees abused customers. She said that everyone, regardless of age or race or economic status, deserved to be treated with basic human respect. She explained that this wasn't just about one incident or one person, but about the kind of society humanity wanted to be. Her words resonated with people watching from their homes and workplaces across the country. Within an hour, her speech was being shared millions of times on social media. People quoted her words about deserving dignity, regardless of having an admiral in the family. They applauded her call for systematic change rather than just individual punishment. News commentators discussed her message on television. Some praised her grace and wisdom. Others debated what kind of training retail workers needed. A few cynical voices suggested she was just seeking attention, but those voices were drowned out by overwhelming support. By evening, major retail chains were already responding. The CEO of Henderson's grocery store's parent corporation released a statement apologizing to Margaret and announcing an immediate review of all management practices. They promised mandatory respect and sensitivity training for employees at all their locations. Other retail companies followed suit, not wanting to be seen as behind the curve on this issue. The Galactic Council, which governed interactions between Earth and alien civilizations, took notice as well. They had been watching humanity's integration into the larger galactic community carefully. How humans treated each other was seen as an indicator of how they would treat other species. The Council released a statement commending Margaret's call for dignity and systematic reform. They noted that this kind of rapid response to injustice was exactly what they hoped to see from member civilizations. Back at the grocery store, the crowd had finally begun to disperse. Police had finished taking statements from witnesses. The dropship still sat in the parking lot, a massive reminder of what had transpired. Patricia had arranged for her mother to be taken to a military medical facility for a thorough checkup, despite Margaret's protests that she was fine. Margaret finally agreed when Patricia pointed out that she needed to make sure there were no hidden injuries that might cause problems later. Before they left, Helen Carter approached them nervously. She had been standing to the side, watching everything unfold, still processing that she had been part of such a significant event. She asked Margaret how she was feeling and if there was anything she could do. Margaret took Helen's hands in hers and thanked her for standing up when it mattered. She told Helen that her courage in calling the police and confronting Kevin had made all the difference. Helen's eyes filled with tears, and she said she had just done what was right. Margaret replied that doing what was right was often harder than people thought and that Helen should be proud of herself. Patricia also thanked Helen and told her that she would be sending a formal commendation to the corporate headquarters. She wanted to make sure Helen's actions were recognized officially. She also quietly told Helen that if she ever faced any retaliation for what she had done, she should contact Patricia directly. Patricia handed Helen a card with contact information. Helen looked at the card in wonder, hardly believing that she now had a direct line to an admiral. Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. News outlets ran feature pieces on Margaret's life, her work during the First Contact War, her late husband's military service, and her children's accomplishments. They painted a picture of a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others and building community. Interviews with people who knew Margaret revealed countless stories of her kindness and generosity. Former shelter residents talked about how she had helped them get back on their feet. Teachers described how she had volunteered in classrooms. Neighbors recalled how she always had food ready for anyone who needed it. The contrast between this portrait of Margaret and Kevin's treatment of her made his actions seem even worse. Kevin Price sat in a jail cell waiting for his bail hearing. His lawyer had told him the case looked bad. There was video evidence from multiple angles. There were dozens of witnesses. The victim had visible injuries and was a respected member of the community. Plus, the national attention on the case meant that prosecutors would be under pressure to pursue it aggressively. Kevin had plenty of time to think about what he had done. At first, he was angry, feeling like he was being made into an example because of who Margaret's daughter was. But as he sat alone in that cell hour after hour, his perspective began to shift. He thought about his own grandmother who had died 2 years earlier. She had been kind and patient with him even when he didn't deserve it. He wondered how he would have felt if someone had treated her the way he treated Margaret. The thought made him feel sick. Kevin's bail hearing was set for 3 days after the incident. When he was brought into the courtroom, he was shocked by how many people were there. The gallery was packed with reporters and concerned citizens. Patricia Williams sat in the front row next to her mother. Kevin couldn't meet their eyes. The prosecutor argued that Kevin should be held without bail because he was a danger to the community. The defense lawyer countered that Kevin had no prior criminal record and wasn't a flight risk. The judge, a stern woman named Barbara Chen, listened to both sides. She looked at Kevin with an expression that made him want to disappear. She set bail at $50,000, a high amount that reflected the seriousness of the charges. She also imposed conditions including that Kevin must stay away from Margaret Williams and from Henderson's grocery store. He was also ordered to begin anger management counseling immediately. Kevin's parents mortgaged their house to make bail. When he was released, reporters swarmed him asking for comments. His lawyer had instructed him to say nothing, so he kept his head down and hurried to his parents' car. Back home, Kevin's life had fallen apart. He had been fired from his job immediately after the arrest. His girlfriend, who had briefly gotten back together with him before the incident, had left again. His social media accounts were flooded with angry messages from strangers. Friends he had known for years weren't returning his calls. He was alone with the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Margaret had returned to her normal life as much as possible. She still cooked dinner for her grandchildren. She still volunteered at the community center. She still took her morning walks through the neighborhood. But things were different now. People recognized her on the street and thanked her for speaking out. She received letters from elderly people all over the world sharing their own stories. Organizations dedicated to protecting senior citizens reached out asking her to be a spokesperson. Patricia watched her mother handle all this attention with the same grace she handled everything else in life. She was proud but also worried. Margaret was 73 years old and had been through a traumatic experience. Patricia wanted to make sure her mother wasn't pushing herself too hard. 3 weeks after the incident, Margaret sat in her living room surrounded by stacks of letters. They came from all over Earth and even from human colonies on Mars and the Moon. Each letter told a story of someone who had been mistreated because of their age or race or disability. Each one thanked Margaret for speaking up and giving them hope that things could change. Margaret read every single letter personally. Some made her cry. Some made her angry. All of them reinforced her belief that what had happened to her was part of a much bigger problem that needed to be addressed. Patricia visited her mother every evening after work. She would bring dinner, and they would sit together going through the letters and discussing what they meant. One evening, Patricia brought up an idea she had been thinking about. She wanted to start a foundation dedicated to protecting elderly citizens from abuse and discrimination. The foundation would provide legal assistance to seniors who faced mistreatment, fund training programs for service workers, and advocate for policy changes at local and national levels. Margaret loved the idea immediately. She said it should be called the Williams Foundation for Elderly Dignity. Patricia agreed and promised to handle all the administrative setup. Within a month, the foundation was officially registered as a non-profit organization. Patricia used her connections in the military and government to recruit board members. She also donated a significant amount of her own money to get it started. Corporations that wanted to show they were taking the issue seriously also contributed. The foundation's first major project was developing a training program for retail and service workers. The program focused on understanding the challenges elderly people faced, recognizing unconscious bias, and treating all customers with respect regardless of their age or appearance. Helen Carter was brought in as a consultant to help develop the program. She shared her experience from working in retail for 15 years and provided valuable insights into what kind of training would actually be effective. The program was tested at several stores and the results were impressive. Customer complaints about mistreatment dropped significantly. Employee satisfaction increased because they felt better equipped to handle difficult situations. Within 6 months, over 300 retail chains had adopted the training program. Meanwhile, Kevin Price's criminal case moved forward through the court system. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was firm. The video evidence was too clear and the public interest too high to let this case be resolved quietly. The trial was scheduled for 4 months after the incident. Kevin spent those months in a strange state of limbo. He couldn't find work because no one wanted to hire someone facing assault charges who had become nationally infamous. He lived with his parents and spent his days attending court-mandated counseling sessions. The counseling was supposed to be just anger management, but Kevin's therapist, a patient man named George Rivera, helped him explore much deeper issues. George helped Kevin understand that his anger wasn't really about bad days or stressful jobs. It came from feeling powerless in his own life and trying to exert control over others to compensate. It came from prejudices he had absorbed growing up but never examined. It came from not knowing healthy ways to handle frustration and disappointment. Slowly, Kevin began to change. He started to genuinely understand what he had done to Margaret and why it was so wrong. He realized that his apologies at the time had been about trying to avoid consequences, not about real remorse. Now he felt actual shame and regret for hurting another person. George suggested that Kevin write a letter to Margaret, not to send necessarily, but as an exercise in taking accountability. Kevin spent days working on that letter. He wrote and rewrote it dozens of times. He wanted to express his genuine remorse without making excuses or asking for forgiveness he didn't deserve. When the letter was finally finished, Kevin asked George if he should actually send it. George said that was up to Kevin, but that he should think carefully about whether sending it would benefit Margaret or just make Kevin feel better about himself. Kevin decided to hold on to the letter for now. The day of the trial arrived with significant media coverage. The courthouse was surrounded by news trucks and protesters. Some protesters carried signs supporting Margaret and demanding justice. A few carried signs about broader issues of racism and elder abuse. Security was tight. Patricia attended the trial every single day, sitting in the front row to show support for her mother. Margaret attended most days, but not all, because sitting through detailed descriptions of her assault was emotionally difficult. The prosecution presented their case efficiently. They showed videos from multiple angles. They brought in witnesses who described what they saw. They had medical testimony about Margaret's injuries. They presented evidence of previous complaints against Kevin that had been ignored by store management. The defense tried to paint Kevin as a good person who made one mistake under stress. They brought in character witnesses, including Kevin's parents and former co-workers, who said he wasn't usually like this. They argued that the media attention and public outrage had already punished Kevin more than necessary. But when the defense put Kevin on the stand, things didn't go as planned. The prosecutor asked Kevin direct questions about what he had done and why. Kevin, who had spent months in therapy learning to take real accountability, answered honestly. He admitted that there was no good excuse for his behavior. He acknowledged that his actions were driven by racism and abuse of power. He said that Margaret deserved better and that he was deeply ashamed. His lawyer looked horrified by these admissions, but Kevin kept talking. He explained what he had learned in counseling about his own issues and prejudices. He said he understood now that intent didn't matter when the impact was harm. He told the jury that he deserved to be held accountable, because that was the only way he could truly make amends. The courtroom was silent when he finished. Even the prosecutor seemed slightly stunned by Kevin's complete acceptance of responsibility. It was rare to see a defendant so thoroughly admit guilt and express genuine remorse. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Kevin showed no surprise. He had known he was guilty from the beginning. The question now was what his sentence would be. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, something unexpected happened. Margaret asked to meet with the prosecutor. Patricia was against this idea, but Margaret was insistent. At the meeting, Margaret told the prosecutor that she had been thinking a lot about justice and what it meant. Margaret explained to the prosecutor that she believed in accountability, but also in rehabilitation. She had watched Kevin's testimony and heard the sincerity in his voice when he took responsibility for his actions. She said that while Kevin needed to face consequences, she hoped those consequences would help him become a better person, rather than just punishing him. The prosecutor listened respectfully but explained that the state was pursuing this case, not just Margaret. There was a broader public interest in showing that assaulting elderly people would not be tolerated. Margaret understood but asked if she could make a statement at the sentencing hearing about what kind of sentence she thought was appropriate. The prosecutor agreed. At the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was once again packed. The judge, Barbara Chen, had reviewed all the evidence and pre-sentencing reports. She called Margaret forward first to give her victim impact statement. Margaret walked slowly to the front of the courtroom with Patricia at her side. She faced the judge and began to speak in a clear voice. She described how the assault had affected her physically and emotionally. She talked about the bruises that had taken weeks to fade, and the anxiety she now felt when entering stores. She explained how difficult it was to trust people in positions of authority when someone had abused that authority against her. But then Margaret's statement took a turn that surprised many people in the courtroom. She said that despite all the pain Kevin had caused her, she had seen genuine change in him during the trial. She believed that people could grow and learn from their mistakes if given the right opportunities. She asked the judge to consider a sentence that included meaningful rehabilitation alongside punishment. She suggested jail time to show that actions have consequences, but also extensive community service working with elderly populations so Kevin could understand the people he had harmed. She recommended continued counseling and mandatory participation in anti-racism training. Patricia squeezed her mother's hand as she spoke, proud of her compassion even towards someone who had hurt her. Kevin's lawyer looked hopeful for the first time in weeks. The prosecutor maintained a neutral expression but seemed thoughtful. Then it was Kevin's turn to address the court. He stood and faced Judge Chen with his hands clasped in front of him. He thanked Margaret for her statement and said he didn't deserve her compassion, but was grateful for it. He told the judge that he accepted full responsibility for his actions and would accept whatever sentence she deemed appropriate. He explained that the past few months had been the hardest of his life, but also the most important because they had forced him to confront who he had been and who he wanted to become. He said that if he could go back and change what happened, he would do so in an instant, but since he couldn't, the only thing he could do was work to be better going forward. Judge Chen listened to everything without showing emotion. When both statements were finished, she took a moment to review her notes. Then she delivered her sentence. Kevin was sentenced to 6 months in county jail followed by 2 years of probation. During probation, he would be required to complete 400 hours of community service at senior centers and nursing homes. He would also continue anger management counseling and participate in a racial justice education program. Additionally, he was ordered to write a formal apology to be published in major newspapers, not to excuse his behavior, but to publicly acknowledge what he had done wrong and warn others not to follow his example. The sentence was firm but not as harsh as it could have been. The judge explained that she was balancing the need for punishment with the genuine remorse Kevin had shown and Margaret's request for rehabilitation focus. She warned Kevin that if he violated any terms of his probation, he would serve an additional 2 years in prison. Kevin accepted the sentence with a nod. As he was led away to begin his jail time, he looked at Margaret one last time and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Margaret nodded in acknowledgement. The months that followed brought significant changes across multiple levels of society. The Williams Foundation for Elderly Dignity grew rapidly with Patricia at the helm. They helped over 500 elderly people in the first year alone with legal issues, provided training to thousands of service workers, and successfully lobbied for new local laws protecting senior citizens from abuse. Helen Carter became the regional manager for Henderson's Grocery Store's parent corporation. She used her position to implement the Dignity Training Program across all locations in the western United States. Customer satisfaction scores improved dramatically in stores where she worked. The corporation recognized her efforts by promoting her again to a national training director position. Meanwhile, Kevin served his 6 months in jail quietly. He used the time to read extensively about civil rights history and the experiences of people different from himself. He wrote in a journal every day, processing his thoughts and feelings. When he was released, he began his community service at a senior center near his parents' home. At first, the elderly residents were wary of him. They had seen him on the news and knew what he had done. But Kevin showed up every single day, on time and ready to help with whatever was needed. He served meals, organized activities, helped with maintenance, and most importantly, listened to the residents' stories. One of the residents was an 80-year-old man named Frank Martin, who had initially refused to interact with Kevin at all. Frank was a veteran who had strong opinions about respect and honor. But over time, he noticed how hard Kevin worked and how genuinely he seemed to care about making amends. One day, Frank asked Kevin why he was really there beyond just fulfilling court orders. Kevin sat down and told Frank everything honestly. He explained about his anger issues, his prejudices, his abuse of power, and the shame he carried. He talked about how Margaret's grace had affected him deeply. Frank listened without interrupting, and when Kevin finished, the old man nodded slowly. He told Kevin that admitting you were wrong was the first step, but the real measure of a person was what they did next. He said that if Kevin kept showing up and kept trying to be better, eventually he might actually become the person he was pretending to be. Those words stuck with Kevin and became a kind of personal motto. 6 months into his community service, Kevin received a letter. It was from Margaret. His hand shook as he opened it. Margaret wrote that she had heard from the senior center director about his excellent work there. She said she was glad to see he was taking his rehabilitation seriously. She didn't fully forgive him because forgiveness took time, but she wanted him to know that she believed people could change and that she hoped he would continue on his current path. Kevin read the letter 3 times and then carefully folded it and put it in his wallet. He carried it with him every day as a reminder of the person he never wanted to be again, and the person he was working to become. 1 year after the incident, Margaret agreed to return to Henderson's grocery store for a special ceremony. The store had been completely renovated and was reopening with new management and new policies. The corporation wanted Margaret to cut the ribbon as a symbolic gesture of moving forward. Patricia was skeptical, but Margaret insisted it was important. On the day of the ceremony, Margaret walked into the store that had been the site of her assault. She felt nervous but also proud. The store looked completely different now. Signs everywhere promoted their commitment to dignity and respect. Employees had been through extensive training. The new manager, Lisa Hayes, who was Helen's cousin and shared her values, greeted Margaret warmly at the door. Margaret toured the store, noting all the changes. There were comfortable seating areas for elderly shoppers to rest. There were employees specifically assigned to help customers who needed assistance. There was even a community board where local senior centers could post information about their programs. When it was time to cut the ribbon, Margaret stood before a crowd of employees, customers, reporters, and community members. Patricia stood beside her along with Helen Carter. Margaret gave a brief speech about how one terrible moment had led to so much positive change. She thanked everyone who had worked to make retail environments more welcoming and respectful. She emphasized that this wasn't just about one store or one corporation, but about creating a culture where everyone, especially the most vulnerable, felt valued and safe. As Margaret cut the ribbon, the crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. It was a moment of celebration, but also of reflection on how far they had all come. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with her grandchildren, helping her make the spaghetti dinner she had planned to make a year ago, on the day of the assault. Her grandson, Danny, now 13, asked her if she was scared to go back to that store. Margaret smiled and told him that she had been nervous, but that fear couldn't stop her from doing what was right. She explained that standing up to injustice sometimes meant facing uncomfortable situations, but that was how change happened. Her granddaughter, Sophie, aged 10, asked if the man who hurt her was sorry. Margaret said yes, she believed he truly was, and that everyone deserved a chance to learn from their mistakes and become better. Up in space on the orbital station Unity,